to talk about bald and golden eagles, and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, thanks. Glad to be here. Let me try and get my screen up here real quick. Hold on one second. Let's see here. All right. Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
So you're able to see it? Okay, let me get into presentation mode. And looks good?
Yes, looks great.
All right. Well, thanks. Glad to be here tonight. My name's Jeff Cooper again. I've been with Department of Wildlife Resources. It'll be 21 years in April. And those of you that aren't familiar with our agency, we are the state wildlife management and regulatory agency. They boiled our mission statement down into 3 words, and I like it. It's conserve, connect, and protect. So conserving wildlife and fisheries resources, connecting people with those resources, and then protecting those resources through resolving wildlife conflict, law enforcement, regulatory development, et cetera. And so we have a whole host of programs related to that mission. I encourage you, if you haven't been, go to our website and see the different programs that we have educationally, access to our wildlife management areas, the research that our staff is doing. It's really a great agency to work for, and I've learned a lot from the, just the superior people that work for this agency. Tonight, I want to talk just a little bit about bald eagles in Virginia. Talk a little bit about their former status, current status, the distribution in Virginia, a little bit nationwide, and some current research that we're doing with bald eagles. And bald eagles are probably one of the greatest wildlife management success stories in the United States. And we'll start out a little bit with a description. Everyone knows sort of the prototypical image of an eagle with the white head, the chocolate brown body, white tail, real heavy bill, very powerful feet for catching fish. They can squeeze about 400 pounds per square inch. So they have very sharp talons, which are the front 3 claws. It's hard to see in this image. And the back claw is a hallux. And, I've had the unfortunate experience, several times of eagles getting their feet on me. And it's a scary experience. Put in the emergency room a couple times because of that. They can really do some damage. In terms of size, if you look at the picture to the right here, the individual, this was a VDOT employee who came out and trapped with us on Cat Point Creek, Rappahannock River. This is an immature eagle. He's about 6'2", so this bird is longer than him. So their wingspan is, 6.5 feet. The smallest birds I've ever captured or handled were males of about 7 pounds. So that would be the small end. The largest birds I've ever captured, handled, were northern birds, probably from Canada or the northeastern United States, and they were, about 12 pounds. Females tend to be a bit larger, about a third larger than males, and females are dominant, as is the case with most raptor species. So we all know what sort of the classic image of the bald eagle: white head, white tail. Some of you may be unfamiliar with the fact that as eagles progress in age, years 1 through 4, they have a very reliable plumage pattern in their head that allows you to kind of age them into year classes. The amount of modeling in the body can vary significantly, so it's not a good way to group a bird into an age class. But when eagles come out of the nest, they have a pretty chocolate brown head. This bird right here Caught it in the winter many years ago. So this was a bird in its first winter. The head's starting to bleach out. This is a first year bird, which they have very dark head, dark bill. This was this part of the bill, if you can see my mouse. And then the cere, the area around the nostril, is dark, as well as the iris. In year 2, they start to get like a white eye line. The eye starts to lighten up a bit. Year 3, their head looks somewhat osprey-like and start to get more yellowing of the bill, yellowing of the eye. Year 4, they kind of have like a mottled or dirty white head, dirty white tail. The iris starts to become yellow. And then their definitive plumage, their adult plumage, they have the classic white head, white tail. Although there are some individuals that will maintain some mottling or speckle, dark speckling in the head and tail. But in general, most of them turn white, but there are those few exceptions. So that's some of the ways you can age a bird on the wing, at least a year class. Once it's an adult, you can't age it unless the bird was banded at a specific age, younger than 4 years. In terms of status, bald eagles suffered, precipitous population decline during the post-World War II era, as many of you all are familiar. And this was due to extensive use of DDT, other persistent compounds like PCBs. And this caused calcium suppression in eagles, which caused eagles to lay clutches with eggs with thin shells. And as a result, the eggs would crack. And over time, the successive decades after World War II, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, eagle production, the production of young, dropped precipitously, and the population crashed. The bird was listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act in the early 70s, later listed under, various state endangered species acts, including Virginia. DDT was banned in the early 70s. And after banning that, what we saw nationwide and in Virginia was a slow recovery initially in the 70s and 80s, early 90s, and then you get into the late 90s, early 2000s, you see a really accelerated growth, and I'll show some graphics on that. Statewide in Virginia, we're probably talking, I say 1,500 to 1,800 breeding pairs in Virginia, but I was talking with Dr. Brian Watts at William and Mary, who used to do most of the surveys in Virginia, aerial surveys. And we probably have a couple thousand breeding pair statewide. They have moved into non-traditional habitats like the Piedmont and the mountains. But just east of I-95, there's certainly over 1,000 breeding pairs in Virginia, which is tremendous abundance for such a small area. And these maps here, these range maps, are somewhat dated. The last systematic survey, aerial survey with high wing Cessna aircraft done by College of William and Mary, it focused on this area here, the coastal plain of Virginia. And the tidal rivers of Virginia are just loaded with eagles. And there are some factors that influence density. And so up around Mason Neck, Dyke Marsh, Fort Belvoir, Quantico, those areas, incredibly dense breeding populations and heavy use by migrant and non-breeding eagles as well. And I'll talk about some of the factors that influence that. The nationwide map, this is an older map too. There are some gaps here that should be filled in, but in general, higher numbers, year-round residents, year-round use by eagles, coastal areas, the Great Lakes, the Pacific Northwest. A lot of the birds in the interior of Canada and Alaska are migratory, and that's because the water freezes over up north and they have no access to food, that being fish is their primary food resource. But on this map, for example, if you look at Iowa, they're showing, winter use. I was out there on a project in 2019 climbing eagle nests, and there's eagles literally scattered across the entire state, not in the abundance as we have here in Virginia, but they're queuing in on farm ponds and rivers. And same thing in Oklahoma. I've climbed eagle nests down there, and they're queuing in on those waterways, and they're scattered throughout the state as well. They'll never have the abundance we do here in Virginia because they don't have the rich food aquatic resource that we do. This is a graphic from the Fish and Wildlife Service. This was their rough estimate, 2018 estimate of number of eagles in the lower 48, about 316,000 eagles they estimate. I think the low in the early 70s was somewhere around 70,000 individuals. So several fold increase in numbers of birds over time. So it's a pretty dramatic recovery. And of course, we're in the Atlantic Flyway, and really the epicenter for eagle activity is the Chesapeake Bay, and a significant portion of this estimated, and again, it's a rough estimate, 80,000 individuals do pass through the Chesapeake Bay region at some point in their life cycle. Here's another graphic just to illustrate the growth curve, and it only goes out to 2005, but you can see where the low of about 30 some odd pairs in the 70s, and then that gradual increase in the 80s, and then it really starts to accelerate. And we started having a doubling rate of the population about every 5-6 years, and that continued well into the 2000s. If we were to take that growth curve out up to here, the current, we'd probably be at about 1,200 pair. The population's still growing in Virginia, although that it's thought, I was talking with Dr. Brian Watts, that number's plateauing out a little bit, but there still is growth, which is pretty incredible for a raptor of that size, and using such a small land mass that they're utilizing here in Virginia. And just kind of give you an idea, and these maps are from William and Mary as well, Center of Conservation Biology, kind of take you by decade what the recovery and movement of birds into former habitat over time. And so this was 1970, about 30 some odd nests. Then you go to 80, they start moving up on the Potomac, other rivers, 90, 2000, and then out to 2007. If we were to take it out another map, it would just be pretty much a red blur there on that map. Now the Chesapeake Bay, the primary factors that are influencing the distribution and abundance of eagles in the bay along the tidal rivers in Virginia as well as Maryland is the salinity gradient. And there's been a lot of research done on this. The tidal fresh, or the upper reaches of the tidal portions of our major rivers, so the Potomac, so up around Mason Neck, Dyke Marsh, etc., down to about Quantico, that's all tidal fresh. As you go further down river, you start to get a little brackish. The oligohaline portion of the river past Fairview Beach down to the Route 301. Those two salinity gradients support the highest number of breeding eagles. It's some of the highest breeding density in the nation. It is the highest breeding density outside of Alaska. Also, it supports thousands of these two salinity gradients on all of these rivers, support thousands of non-breeding and migrant eagles during the summer and winter months. So salinity is important, and the reason it's important is because salinity influences prey base. And traditional spawning grounds for anadromous fish, the shad runs overlap nicely with those two salinity gradients. Many of our winter waterfowl areas overlap well with those salinity gradients, and eagles do feed on waterfowl in the wintertime. So in addition to our dense breeding population, we also have what we call bald eagle concentration areas. And these are shoreline segments along our tidal rivers. And the Potomac The Potomac and James River are very comparable. They're really supreme concentration areas, and we used to survey these regularly. In past decades, we haven't done so much in recent years. We may take a snapshot again to see how it's doing, but we used to do pretty intensive work on these areas. And basically, these are areas that receive consistent high use by migrants, as well as local birds as well. And so these are elevated abundances on these given shoreline segments. It's abundance in excess of the local breeding pairs and their offspring. And it's utilized by all age classes of eagles. And we actually have shoreline segments on our tidal rivers designated, as high, medium, low use. And that's utilized in our environmental review process for development, shoreline stabilization projects, et cetera. So, we actually used our survey data to develop that prioritization layer to help guide, shoreline activities within these concentration areas. And here's where they're located in the Chesapeake Bay region. For the most part, the largest one is the Potomac River, stretching from roughly Fort Belvoir up to about maybe Dyke Marsh, all the way down to Route 301, and that's where the water starts to turn saline. Numbers start to become more diffuse as the water becomes more saline. Then on the Rappahannock River, for those of you that are familiar with it, from about just above Port Royal down to about Tappahannock, and then from the 295 bridge to actually this area stretches down to Hog Island. It should extend down here a little further. Then Aberdeen Proving Grounds on the Northern Bay, really great area. And there's a few areas over on the shore as well where you get these concentrations of eagles during the winter and summer months. And so here's the phenology of the 3 different populations that utilize the bay. We have our Chesapeake Bay population that's here year round, composed of breeders, juveniles, subadults, and non-paired adults. And that's an increasing trend, is that we have more and more adults that are not paired. We call them floaters, and basically they're adults that are constantly roaming the landscape looking for an opportunity to to develop a territory or acquire a mate. But because the habitat is becoming so saturated with current pairs, breeding pairs, and pairs are very fidelic and territorial of their area, it's hard for some of these adults that have just come online breeding age to find mates because there's so many eagles. During the late fall winter months, we have northeastern birds, and when I say northeast, that would be the northeastern United States and northeastern Canada. We get a big influx of those birds. They start trickling in sometime in November. Numbers peak in January or February. Abundance is contingent upon how cold it is up north. So if you have, a very cold winter up north, we tend to get a lot more eagles in the Chesapeake Bay region. And that's because the lakes and rivers and waterways are freezing over and they don't have access to food. So they come down here to spend time foraging on waterfowl and scavenging on the landscape. The other population, this is sort of the inverse situation, is from the southeast, Gulf of Mexico, Florida birds. And these are eagles that are they're considerably small. Well, I shouldn't say considerably, they're somewhat smaller than eagles we have here. They're like 7-pound birds, 8-pound birds, which is pretty small. But anyway, they have an earlier breeding season in the southeast, a few months earlier than we do. So they complete their breeding season, and the young from nests in the southeast begin dispersing northward to the bay, followed by adults. And that starts to happen sometime in April. Numbers peak in mid-June, July, and then they start heading south again. And, in the early or late summer, early fall. Reason for this is the waters warm up in the south, and the fish go deeper in the water column. And because eagles are catching fish and very near the surface, access to fish is somewhat limited. So they migrate north to the bay where they can access fish throughout the summer. And this just a map, a graphic from a study that was done by Brian Millsap. The use of these southern migrants utilizing the bay was first documented by Dr. Mitchell Bird at College of William and Mary. Basically, Brian Millsap, they tagged a bunch of birds in Florida, nestlings with satellite transmitters, and over 80% of the birds, the epicenter of where they went after fledging and dispersal from their natal area was the Chesapeake Bay. So the bay is really a significant component of the life cycle of these southern birds. And just to kind of give you just a quick look at kind of what it looks like, it's birds from these southern source populations coming north. And then, it starts out with juvenile birds followed by adults. Sometime in midsummer, it's roughly half adults, half juvenile birds. And then they start peeling out to the south, heading back to their natal grounds. Same thing occurring in the winter, with juveniles coming in first in November, followed by adults, numbers peaking in January, February, and then they're heading north as we speak right now. A lot of these birds, the adults have probably already left because they're setting up their nest sites and, their breeding behaviors and that sort of thing. So the Chesapeake Bay region, again, it is the epicenter of eagle conservation. And the reason for that is, number one, it's the densest breeding population in the east, actually the lower 48. It's comparable to Alaska densities. So you have that robust breeding population. Secondly, it's a vital component for both northern and southern populations. They rely on the bay, they converge on the bay for either wintering or summering habitat. So what happens in the bay has an impact on populations away from the bay. So that's, in bird conservation, you often have to think at large scales because these animals are operating at very large scales. And I just want to touch on one of our research projects. We just finished up a lead study looking at lead levels in avian scavengers and eagles, both balds and goldens being one of those. And we had a PhD student, Vince Slavey, Dr. Vince Slavey now, and he just got a paper published in Science. There's been a lot of press on it. You may have seen some stuff in National Geographic about the paper. But anyway, if you want information on that paper, it's pretty good. But he delves into lead ammunition and using alternatives to abate or minimize lead poisoning in eagles, which is significant. But I want to talk just a little bit about what we're working on now, and that's abating or minimizing airstrike of eagles in military and civilian aircraft, because eagles are such a success story from a population perspective. Like other wildlife species, as they increase, you start to get human conflict or human management issues that are challenging. And this is one of the challenges we're facing that, has potentially, high stakes for human safety. And, it's just a picture. It was of an eagle strike, one ding, one dent in a plane, that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. There's been cases of eagles crashing through the cockpits of windshields. So it's a very large bird that could cause a catastrophic failure of aircraft. So we're working with the Langley Air Force Base right now, and they're really concerned about their training mission down there and eagles and potential airstrike, particularly with the very expensive aircraft they have. But this, I believe this is a breeding bird survey map, and it's just showing these blue areas, essentially showing, consistent increase in population over time. And I don't know if you can see this graphic or not, but at the end, over time, as eagles have eagle numbers have increased, so have the number of airstrikes with eagles throughout the throughout the United States. And if we look at nationwide map, Florida and Virginia are really the hot spots for collisions of eagles and aircraft. The other area would be Washington State, Puget Sound area, and Alaska. The issue with Virginia and Maryland, or Virginia and Florida, is that most of our major airports occur in prime eagle habitat near these riverine environments, near water, that sort of thing. So it's definitely one of the major aviation wildlife management challenges we have, not only eagles, but other species that are associated with water. And this is just a map showing, what we're dealing with in terms of nests. And you can see the number of collisions from 7 from 1990 to 2009, and then 18 collisions in 2010 to 15. And I should mention these are minimum number of collisions. All collisions aren't necessarily reported, especially at smaller airports. I want to talk a little bit about some of the methods we use to investigate eagles. And these are the methods we use for this airstrike study, as well as other studies. And, what we've looked at over the years is the spatial ecology of these birds, tracking birds. How are they using the landscape two-dimensionally, like a map, but also three-dimensionally? How do they use airspace? And that's important when trying to mitigate or assign risk to aircraft activity in a given area. And the primary transmitter platform that we're using, and this is an older one, they're much smaller now, but this is a cellular transmitter manufactured by Cellular Tracking Technologies. And it fits on the back of an eagle backpack style. There's straps that go across its shoulders and then comes across the keel under the wings, and it's attached here and here with knots, and you sew it shut. The default resolution for acquiring a location of an eagle on these units, we have them set typically at 15 minutes, but we usually have a heavier duty cycle every 4 to 5 weeks where we're capturing data, I think, at the 5-second interval. And that's so that some of our academic partners can do spatial modeling in a 3D type way. And this is just a map just showing some of the dispersal of the birds we've tracked. This is Langley Air Force Base. And these are some of the movements of nestlings that we tagged in nests around the base. And here's our primary method for capturing free-flying eagles. So these would be adults and sub-adults. So birds that aren't in the nest. And we do this in the winter. And what we do is we have a 60 by 40 foot net that is powered by 3 rockets with explosives in it. And we have a blasting wire rigged to these rockets. And we hide in a portable deer blind typically, or if there's a barn nearby or some structure nearby, and we bait them in with roadkill deer. We acquire it from VDOT. And the thing about trap eagles can be wary. So when we set up a bait site, we have to set it up so it looks exactly like when we trap, because if you change something the day you go to trap, the eagles won't come down on the bait. So we monitor these sites with trail cameras, and once the eagles are on there regularly, we'll sneak in the dark, set up our net, and wait. And some days nothing, but when it's happening, it's pretty cool. And this is a grainy image, but the eagle is there with some vultures, and that one almost got out, but that's a subadult right there. And that was on Cat Point Creek in one of their soybean fields. Let me see here. Advance it. That's just another shot of it. The other method, and this is a golden eagle, but we do capture them this way as well. It's called a bow net, and it's just a net that is on an oval frame that's hinged in the center, and it folds over on top of itself, and you have a leather trigger with some grommets in it and a string. It's incredibly simple. But this is a golden eagle in Bath County, Virginia. We've captured a lot of golden eagles too, investigating wind energy. So we have quite a golden eagle database as well. But this is the bird just coming in. I opened up the deer on the back to force the animal to feed where I wanted them, so I had a higher probability of capture. Here, I'll just kind of fast forward through it so you can see the capture. And the bird's a little wary at first. They look around, and then eventually they get up on the bait. Eagles like to get on top of a bait, their prey or their bait. That's called mantling. So they're kind of protecting the bait from other animals, but they're really wary. And I should have pulled the trigger right there, but a raven came by, kind of spooked him, and he kind of got sideways on me, but we still captured the animal. I usually give them a little time to feed. Let's see if we can get here we go. And there it is in slow motion. This was a VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, came out and filmed that capture with me. Oh, go again. Trying to advance this. Okay. The other way, capturing nestlings. We do that by climbing trees, and we use traditional arborist techniques. One technique you're probably familiar with, or you've seen, where you wear spurs on your legs, your feet, and you basically walk up the tree with a lanyard around the back of the tree and attached to your harness. And this is for you naturalists out there, you might see this isn't a Virginia tree species here. This is a spruce. This is an aspen tree I was climbing in Michigan. I went up to help out the Dawa Indians on a project up there a few years back. And this is one of my buddies, an eagle legend, Terry Grubb. He's probably climbed more eagle nests than anyone in North America. He was a former Navy SEAL, just a legendary figure. But anyway, the other way that we do this is we'll shoot a line over top of a branch near the nest or above the nest, and then pull our rope over with that skinny line. And you've probably seen rock climbers use ascenders. You attach it to your harness and you inchworm your way up the tree. And this is just a little video of what it looks like. This was an easy tree to climb. It was maybe a 90-foot high nest. I'm 6 feet tall, and you can see the nest is maybe a little taller than me. So that was an average size nest. It was maybe 6 feet deep, 7 feet across. But I've seen there's a nest near Possum Point Power Station. I don't know if it's still there, but it was probably 15 feet deep at least. Tremendous nest. But you just kind of work your way up to the nest, with that gear, using lanyards. And then we have a hook. You probably, some of you all that are familiar with chickens, you have a chicken hook to grab the bird by their legs. It doesn't hurt them. You're just hooking them and pulling the bird to you. And we put them in a bag, and then I'll lower them to a ground crew. And so once, let me see if I can advance this. There we go. Once, here's just kind of a view of what it looks like in the nest. This was in Iowa in 2019. I took this with my phone, just some pictures of these chicks out near a reservoir. Those chicks are about 7 weeks old. So that's kind of what they look like in the nest. One other way that we catch eagles, it's not as a successful method as rocket netting or climbing trees or the bow net, but it does, we probably have like about a 250 batting average. So if you get, 12, 13 birds hit a fish, you're going to catch a bird that given day. But basically we'll use gizzard shad. We'll open up the gut cavity, put a piece of foam in it, make some monofilament nooses that are threaded through the back of the fish. It floats belly up, and there's heavy spider wire that goes to a floating block, which is much too heavy for the eagle to fly off with. And they get their talons snagged, and then they just ease down in the water, and we motor up with the boat and grab them out of the water and process the bird. And that's the picture to the left here is a bird that we captured with fish noose. So once you have the birds on the ground, this is a buddy of mine several years ago. We got the bird and we take our measurements. We band the bird typically with a USGS federal band. We also use color bands. We used to use purple, now we're using red. Often we take blood samples. This was particularly important when we were doing the lead work. We were looking at blood lead levels to get an indication of what the lead load was in a given bird. And then putting the transmitter on, which is put on the back of the animal. This whole process it depends on how well the bird behaves. Some birds are really aggressive and don't calm down real well. So it can take anywhere from 35 minutes to an hour at the most. And this is a map. It's not all the birds that we've tagged, but since 2007, 8, I guess, the department, we've been involved in tagging over 130 individual eagles with cellular transmitters. And I guess this is a snippet between 13 and 20. And this was for our larger airstrike study. Again, most of the birds we tagged in the Bay region heavily exploit the Bay. The longer migrations typically are northward, as you can see on the map. There are some southerly movements. There's a couple tracks here missing that I noticed. There was one bird that was captured here in Virginia. We captured it. It dispersed up to Long Island, went to a landfill, presumably feeding at the landfill. And then it flew south, basically tracking I-95 and flew all the way to Florida. And it did that in just a number of, a few days, several days. So these birds, the world to these birds is a lot smaller than it is to you and I, because they operate at such large scales, and they can be somewhere really quick, particularly when weather is favorable, winds are favorable, that sort of thing. Something kind of interesting, this is a subset of the data. That map to the left is just one example. But generally what's happening, we've tagged a lot of nestlings. We've published this work. Dr. Trish Miller's the lead author on our publication. She's with Conservation Science Global. We published this work in the Journal of Wildlife Management. And so you tag a bird at their natal area, their nest area, and then they typically will make, a fairly significant movement, over 100 kilometers within the first 100 days. And then within a year, they've moved back somewhere near that natal area. Then they do the same thing again. They'll disperse outward again, and then eventually make their way back. And most birds will try and make a living or find a territory in their natal area. There are some individuals that do peel off into, their non-natal areas further north, that sort of thing. But in general, most of these birds are coming back to their natal area, where the nest that they fledged from. And going back to airstrike, so all this dark mess is all the GPS locations from our birds, and all these dots here are air stations. So you can see that there's quite an overlap of eagle use and aviation airspace. So pretty significant conflict there that represents a challenging wildlife management issue. And it's just a little bit of the data just some examples. This is Langley Air Force Base, and this is just showing the tracks of birds that have been tagged in and around Langley Air Force Base and how they're interacting with airspace. And Dr. Trish Miller, who's probably the leading spatial ecologist for raptors, eagles particularly. She's done a lot of our spatial modeling for golden eagles and looking at wind energy threats and that sort of thing. But she uses this spatial data to assign risk to a given resource. So with the case of an airport, it's to inform pilots, aviation, the military, their training spaces if there's going to be a high interaction with eagles and a high risk of strike. And this top image is Langley Air Force Base and their takeoff and their landing paths. And she's using this kind of data to overlay with the telemetry data to inform military, where that risk may occur. Also looking at nest sites, what nest sites may be of high risk. There have been a couple instances in Virginia, Norfolk International Airport. Actually, we had to have a nest removed that was right by the airfield. But this kind of data too will allow her to assign a risk of a given nest. Should that nest be managed? Should it be maybe even moved potentially? But this telemetry data helps us look at that. And I guess with that, I can take any questions. I was going to talk a little bit about golden eagles, but I was having technical problems with the presentation. My computer crashed, so I apologize for the images being a little grainy, but I had to cut and paste everything into Google Slides because my computer crashed. But anyway, I'll take any questions that anyone might have.
Jeff, we have quite a few in the chat, and I'd be happy to read those for you if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, the first one is interested to hear about the West Virginia University research on golden eagles in West Virginia. So I don't know if you have a link to that we could send to people, and if you don't have it now, we could probably share that later with our site.
Yep. The best place to go for that would be two places. Conservation Science Global. I think their website was having some issues here recently. Or if you just Google the Eastern Golden Eagle Working Group, which we are members of, the Department of Wildlife Resources, there's a lot of information in there on the work that's been done in the East. And with golden eagles, that was really a large-scale collaborative project where we got involved in the very early, or the inception of the project, and it now encompasses most of the eastern states, the eastern Canadian provinces, Canadian federal government, our federal government, NGOs, various state agencies, the wind industry. So yeah, it's really expanded, and there's quite a few peer-reviewed publications out there as well. But yeah, Eastern Golden Eagle Working Group and Conservation Science Global. There's one more website called Katzner Lab, and that's Dr. Katzner. He's one of the leading raptor ecologists in the country that we've worked with, and it's spelled Katzner. I don't know how much he keeps that up to date, but I do know there's some information on there, but it's called Katzner Lab.
Thank you. And the next question is, what is the average lifetime age of a bald eagle in the wild?
That's a good question. Eagles are long lived species. Mortality is highest in obviously their first year of life. Each successive year, the probability of survival increases. I'm not sure the average, but I can tell you the range. The oldest eagle that I've ever picked up was an injured eagle on the Potomac River, and we knew the age of it because it was banded by a federal biologist as a nestling. So it was year one when it was banded, and it was 28 years old, and it was injured. I retrieved it. That was early in my career. I've captured birds a few times, 12, 15, 17 years old. I think the wild record is in the low 30s, like 32, 34 years. So these birds are easily living, a decade and a half, probably on average, at least a decade. So they are long-lived species.
Next question is, what is the extent of your department's tagging and tracking program?
Well, with bald eagles, the extent of that geographically, it's been focused on the coastal plain of Virginia. So basically east of I-95. We started tagging bald eagles with cellular transmitters, and I have to stretch my memory here, 2007 or 8. And we've tagged birds probably every year. We started out just tagging a few. Then we started getting involved in looking at winter ecology, how these birds moved around the bay. And then we started investigating ways to mitigate airstrike in 2013. So we tagged, over 100 birds in that study. And now we're working with Langley Air Force Base. I think we captured 8 this winter. The weather got kind of warm on me here in February, and we couldn't get them into bait. But so we've tagged well over 130 individuals. I do want to work with our education folks about getting some of that information online, some maps, some stuff like that. Golden eagles, we've tagged about 40 individuals, and that occurred in the mountains of Virginia, stretching from northwestern Virginia up around Shenandoah County, Woodstock area, all the way down to Saltville, the Clinch Mountain area. So we had the whole span of the mountains, and that was purposeful. We wanted to catch birds, throughout the mountains to see what source populations they migrated to and how they use the mountains, and golden eagles, that is, and how big their winter range was. So yeah, that's kind of the extent of our tagging trapping program. We will be climbing nests again this spring to tag some more birds, and that'll be down in the Newport News, Hampton area around Langley Air Force Base.
Thank you. Next, we have, to what degree can the public participate in the preservation of bald eagle areas?
Yeah, I mean, it's always good. Yeah, always good that if you do see a transmitter on a bird, because we do frequently get pictures of birds that we've tagged. And often what we do is we'll write the number of the transmitter that you can actually see it on the transmitter with some of these high quality lenses. So we've gotten pictures of birds where the transmitter was no longer functioning. We thought the bird was actually dead, but it was actually still alive, and it was a gear malfunction. Also, if you see any color bands, and you can read the numbers, particularly on the Potomac River up there, that would be helpful, reporting that to us. Also, there's not a whole lot of nest monitoring going on anymore. So, I mean, that's always useful information to relay. And for you birders that are out in the Piedmont, Ridge and Valley places outside the coastal plain, there's a lack of information on nesting birds in that part of the state. They do occur, we do have nesting statewide, literally in every county of Virginia. And they are on the, the inland rivers. We've done surveys on those, but there is a big lack or data gap inland, particularly.
Next, we have what is the best time to see eagles hunting?
Best time to see eagles hunting, that would depend on the weather. So in the summer, when they're fishing, they tend to do that relatively early in the morning. So the early morning hours, so, maybe 7 a.m. to about 10 a.m. Once it starts getting hot in the summer, and it can get pretty hot out on those rivers, they will hunker down. They may feed in the evening as well. In the winter time, if it's really cold, which it should be cold now, it's kind of bizarre. Usually this is a good time for us to capture eagles, but the weather's just too warm and their diet is shifted. So in the winter, they're scavenging. They can't, there's not fish readily available typically in the winter. And eagles are a little late in getting up. And a lot of times that's due to they like the warmer air. It's easier for them to fly. And that's when you usually will see them, numbers starting to really pick up 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. And, they'll be soaring the shorelines, adjacent fields to the rivers, that sort of thing. The peak time that we capture birds is typically between 9 and 1 or 2 in the afternoon. And then in the winter, they do go back to their roost relatively early. So yeah, that would sort of be, that time of year contingent. Pretty warm right now. You could probably see them, pretty much any time of the day with this nice weather, which is unusual for this time of year. But
The next comment we have is this. When I was a kid in the 70s, the Potomac was very polluted by industry. It was cleaned up, and then the invasive hydrilla plant filled the river. Please share your opinion on the cleanup, river ecosystem, and hydrilla. I've heard that hydrilla may actually have helped initially because it added oxygen for fish and was one of the few plants that would survive.
yeah, some of that's a bit out of my wheelhouse in terms of the hydrilla. I mean, the hydrilla, I've talked to some fisheries biologists, it does provide some good cover for fish and, the fishery resource. In terms of the cleanup, certainly, I don't know a lot of details on that. Certainly that has improved the fishery, the wildlife resource, that sort of thing. But yeah, I just don't know enough about hydrilla and how the interaction with the ecosystem to be able to speak to that to any degree. I do know, snakeheads, invasive species in the Potomac. I think they like those hydrilla beds as well. And I've actually found snakeheads in eagle nests. So, well, something
Good.
that's a little interesting too. I know I'm getting a little off topic, but it kind of just raised, blue catfish really are the primary prey base for these eagles, in the tidal fresh and brackish areas. And that's a introduced species as well. And it does quite well in those environments. But anyway, yeah, that's, contaminants, hydrilla, that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. One of our fisheries biologists could probably speak better to that than I could.
The next two I'm going to ask together because they're somewhat similar.
Okay.
Did the floaters move out of our region looking for other breeding areas since our area is becoming saturated? And what is the resolution or negative repercussion of having so many floaters or unpaired eagles searching for territory?
Yeah, that's a great question. We actually, we thought we caught an adult at Bethel Reservoir near Langley Air Force Base, and I thought it was a local breeder. It was a male, small feet, smaller bird. We let it go. That was back in January after we captured it with gear on it. And it turns out it's a floater. It's an adult, and it's just kind of wandering around, that lower portion of the bay there. In terms of them, venturing outside the Bay region, I'm sure that occurs. We don't have a lot of documented, quantitative information on floaters in general, but I would suspect they do pioneer out, outside the Bay because it is becoming more saturated. One of the negative things, obviously, when you have all these floaters and excess of adults, is you get more aggression. Probably the leading cause of injury and death for eagles is other eagles. So you do get a lot of fighting. These birds do like to fight. And these floaters are constantly looking for opportunities to either if they're a male, push out a male and take his place in a pair, or yeah, females as well. So they're constantly trying to either invade a given territory, take a pair member's place. So yeah, a lot of increased aggression for sure, which results in more injured eagles and that sort of thing.
Next question is, how far from a nest will an eagle hunt for food?
That's contingent on the quality of the habitat around the nest itself. So for example, we did inland surveys on rivers, inland rivers in Virginia. So the Shenandoah River, Rapidan, Upper Rappahannock, the Upper James, a lot of these inland rivers, and nests out there. The Shenandoah River, for example, the North and South Fork of the Shenandoah and the main stem, those nests are scattered every 10, 12, 15 miles. And the reason they're scattered that far is the prey resource, fish or scavenging, is more diffuse than say in the coastal plain along these tidal rivers. So they have to forage a larger area. Whereas in the coastal plain, you get such a impressive nest density that it almost seems unbelievable sometimes. There was a 20-acre soybean field near Port Royal, right on the Rappahannock River. So 20 acres, it was a rectangular field. That's not that big. There was an eagle nest on each corner of that field. And I remember we climbed all the nests on that field that day. But you literally have nests like up around Dyke Marsh, Mason Neck, that peninsula there. There's literally a nest every half mile, and we've climbed most of those nests. And the reason they're so packed together is there's so much food availability. So they're not foraging very far at all. They're foraging very near the nest. And they're also able to still forage while there's, non-breeders utilizing those same areas and overlap in territory. So it's highly contingent on the quality of the foraging habitat. So that will shrink, the distance they will forage from a nest.
Next two questions are related. What is the count of Goldens in the Chesapeake region, including the Potomac, and what percentage of eagles are golden versus bald?
That's a good question too. In terms of the number of golden eagles in Virginia, that's not well known. The eastern subpopulation, there's a subpopulation that's distinct from the western population of golden eagles. They come out of northeastern Canada. There's no breeders in the states in the east, but Virginia, West Virginia, the central Appalachian Mountains, that's sort of the core of the wintering area for the northeastern Canada source population. So those birds are spending, almost half their life cycle down here in our mountains. Now, in terms of golden eagles over in the coastal plain, it does occur, but it's not nearly to the extent as the mountains. These are birds that prefer the mountains, high forested landscapes. But I have had golden eagles on a bait site at Quantico, Virginia. So that's right there. And I have seen a few here and there, but they're very few and far between in the coastal plain. Some reliable areas in the coastal plain to see them are actually the Eastern Shore. What was it, Blackwater Refuge over in Maryland? They're routinely there. But it's predominantly a mountain species. We don't know how many are in the state at any given time, but we do know we have extensive use, and that's based on our telemetry data of birds that we've tracked. So.
Thank you. Next is, are eagles impacted negatively by artificial light at night? Any studies on this?
I'm not aware of any, but I will say this about eagles. They've adapted quite well to human influenced landscapes. Dr. Mitchell Bird, I guess he's in his 90s now, but he was, one of the first people to survey eagles in Virginia. But he told me back in the day, when, the 60s, 70s, eagles were very fearful of people. And, he speculated that's because they were frequently shot by people, in the early decades of the previous century. Eagles are still shot, but it's not nearly to the extent it was. Also, eagles are adapting, kind of like osprey, to a suburban urban landscape. There's many nests in Northern Virginia right around Mason Neck. I shouldn't say many, but several nests that we've climbed in people's backyards, literally. So, but I do know of many nests in Northern Virginia in backyards. Richmond, same thing. There's nests on near bombing ranges on some of these military installations, near airport runways. I mean, so they will and they have adapted to sort of this human influence in terms of lighting, the impact. I don't know that anyone's ever looked at that. They are diurnal, so they're not typically flying at night, although that does occur sometimes. But there's no studies that I'm aware of with eagles and looking at lighting. But I guess the one thing I can say is they are adapting to, a more suburban urban landscape.
What age do the birds get their yellow feet?
Oh, their feet are yellow when they come out of the nest. Their bill becomes totally yellow about their 4th, 5th year. So yeah, their feet are pretty much yellow. The nestlings, their feet are just so clean and pristine. But you catch a bird that's been flying around in the wild and it's all scarred up and usually scabs, and because they're always fighting, and they make their living with their feet. But yeah, their feet are yellow when they come out of the nest.
While you were at the nest, did the parents get aggressive to try and protect their nestlings?
Well, if they did, we probably wouldn't be in the nest. Thank God they don't, because they can do some major damage. No, they typically will just fly around above the nest, with distress calls. I know of one instance, my colleague Terry Grubb, who I climb eagle nests with, that I showed a picture of in the presentation. He had an instance where he was climbing into the nest, and the female wouldn't leave. She just kind of poked her head over the edge of the nest. But I think that's the only encounter. There's a couple occurrences of eagles buzzing people in Alaska that I've heard of anecdotally, and there are nests actually on the ground in Alaska. I'm kind of getting off the topic, but we do have a couple of nests on the ground in Virginia, and those occur over on our barrier islands where there's no predatory pressure. And there's nowhere to really nest, so they built their nest right on the ground near some pelican colonies.
Wow. Do we know about collisions at National Airport or Dulles?
Those are reported. I don't know the specific numbers, but yeah, there have been documented strikes with eagles there for sure. I don't know those exact numbers. USDA Wildlife Services, they have staff at all these airports, and their mission is to try and minimize or prevent airstrike, and they do that through managing wildlife, if that's the deer herd, or if it's eagles getting on runways. Usually, typically what they do is they scare them off, or if it's managing maybe a nest that's near an airport, or a roost or something like that of vultures or eagles or whatever. But yeah, there have been documented strikes at those airports.
How do you work to minimize wind energy risks?
Well, we have a interesting project now. It's not related to bald eagles, but it probably would benefit bald eagles. And most of our wind energy development in Virginia is being planned in our mountains. There is some offshore wind being planned. We don't have any facilities constructed yet. There is one being constructed, but the data we gathered with the birds that we captured and put telemetry devices on, golden eagles in the mountains of Virginia, as well as the larger sample of birds from other states. So there's been roughly 115 or so golden eagles in the east outfitted with telemetry, and that's resulted in like a database of several million GPS locations. And so we actually have a contract right now with Conservation Science Global, Dr. Trish Miller, and she's creating a 3D aerial resource model. So basically what she can do is she'll create this model, and the model's based on the telemetry data, and she can highlight how the eagles are utilizing the ridge line, so she can calculate the average above ground level of these birds, that sort of thing. So she can take that model, and then the wind industry can overlay the footprint of their wind facility, and her model can go down to a 30 by 30 meter resolution, and she can actually model in the rotor sweep of these turbines to see if a given sighting of a turbine is of higher or lower risk of collisions with eagles. So that's what we're doing right now. It's one of the few times in my career where we actually have data to minimize or mitigate a management issue on the landscape. Usually the issue is there, and then we're collecting data after the fact and trying to figure out how to mitigate or minimize impacts of a given resource or issue. So yeah, so we're still working pretty extensively with trying to guide wind energy in Virginia, and it's through that modeling effort with Conservation Science Global.
Sounds like very timely research.
Yeah.
We are doing a lot of invasive plant control in Dyke Marsh, and we also have nesting eagles. How far away would you recommend that people stay away from nests?
Yeah, during the breeding season, and just roughly in our bald eagle management guidelines, we say December 15th through July 15th. And that kind of provides a little buffer on each end of the breeding season. So that would give you a little bit of buffer at initiation and incubation. And then by July 15th, the young are well gone. I would say, well, it depends on the landscape. If it's already an area highly used by people, that sort of thing. So it can be variable, but just sort of generally about 300 feet. And then once that time of year bracket or time of year restriction I just mentioned, December 15th or July 15th, you could go up to the nest and it's not going to harm anything.
How do they fly? Is it all visual cues? Is it geomagnetic? And how high can they fly?
Yeah, they can fly pretty darn high, several thousand feet. I could get an exact number from Trish Miller, but it was pretty high. I mean, it was like 8,000-9,000 feet, something like that. So that they can get up there, and they will utilize those high winds. Yeah, they do use visual cues. It's also thought that maybe some magnetic cues as well, but they really know exactly where they're at. One of the things that we're doing at Langley that kind of speaks to this is they wanted to test the hypothesis of, okay, if you trap a problem bird and you relocate that bird, a given distance away from, say, Langley Air Force Base, will that bird come back? Will that eliminate that problem bird issue? And we have looked at that a little bit. we didn't trap any adult birds because we didn't want to take breeders away from their breeding grounds, but we have relocated, a handful of subadult birds and basically drove them a few hours west, let them go. And it seems like eventually they find their way back. They know exactly where they are on the landscape. So yeah, it's pretty remarkable.
You had mentioned the high lead content, and then what is causing that?
Yeah, we had a PhD student. Now Dr. Vince Slaby did an excellent job for us. Our department, we were very fortunate that they invested money and time and staff time into this project. It was a multi-year project, about 5 years of data collection. The primary cause, and he looked at lead levels across the seasons, so spring, summer, winter, fall. And I also wanted him to design it pre-hunting season, post-hunting season, because spent lead ammunition has always been suspected, but there had never been any real good studies that had documented that. So the primary agent for lead getting into eagles is spent lead ammunition from high velocity rifle rounds. I'm a deer hunter. I've deer hunted many years. And there are alternatives to that, copper ammunition, which is non-toxic. But so what happens is eagles, during the fall switch from feeding on fish. As the fish go deeper in the water column, they're no longer available, so they start scavenging. And so during the hunting season, gut piles on the landscape. Sometimes deer aren't recovered, when they're shot. And it can take, something the size of a grain of rice that can poison an eagle. And his study, and you can look it up, there's been a lot of press coverage. There was some stuff in National Geographic. The paper was just published in Science a week or two ago. So, top tier journal. So I was really happy about that. And, basically he came to the conclusion that over half the North American bald eagle population potentially is poisoned with clinical levels of lead. And when the birds are in the nest, we looked at, okay, when does this lead start getting into eagles? When does this start to occur? So we looked at nestlings and adults and subadults, during the spring months. And nestlings essentially have no lead. They're being fed fish, during their early part of their life, the first several months of their life, or the first few months of their life by the parents. But as the birds go through subsequent winters and they have to scavenge in the winter, they start picking up lead. And lead in raptors is digested somewhat. Like in mammals, a lot of times it's just passed through. If you would eat a piece of lead, you would pass a lot of that. But because their stomachs are so acidic, their digestive tract is so acidic, some of that gets digested, gets into the bloodstream, and eventually into the organs. And then eventually that's stored into the bone. And if the animals keep scavenging subsequent years, keeps being stored into the bone, and then that's recirculated from bone back into the blood system. So they're chronically, they have this chronic levels of lead that would be considered clinical lead toxicosis. So it's primarily from spent ammunition, and one of the best ways to resolve that is educating the hunting community about the use of lead ammunition and potentially poisoning eagles and other raptors, and using the alternatives out there. And we are working on education related to that, maybe some ammo voucher programs. We've thought about maybe trying to, that's been done in some states like California, some of the western states, to encourage non-lead ammunition. But yeah, it's primarily lead ammunition.
What are the natural predators of eagles?
Other eagles, nestlings. Nestlings are killed frequently by great horned owls, raccoons. Eggs are sometimes destroyed by squirrels. Raccoons eat a lot of eggs, but yeah, eagles fear other eagles, I think, for the most part. Nestlings obviously are vulnerable. We have really high raccoon populations, so they do kill a number of eagles. Great horned owls as well. They're capable of killing an adult if they get on the female's back at night, a great horned owl, that is. But those are the primary predators of eagles. Eagles used to be shot by humans a lot, but that's not so much the case anymore. I mean, it does occur occasionally, but I mean, eagles used to be shot a lot in the early part of the 1900s. So,
Do you use eBird or iNaturalist or other reports for data?
I haven't used eBird for eagle data, but there is a lot of value in eBird. I know we have our breeding bird atlas right now, who's Sergio Harding. You might be interested in having him talk about the breeding bird atlas. He's the coordinator of that project, and all that atlas data is going in eBird, which is awesome because then he can start, you got a baseline for looking at trends and distribution, extrapolating that into abundance, that sort of thing. So hasn't been so much used for eagles just because there's been pretty extensive work done by the scientific community, agencies, that sort of thing. Where eBird data probably would be really useful are these inland nests that I mentioned. So that's something, glad you mentioned that. That's something we could look into to see what's popping up in the Piedmont, out in the Ridge and Valley area, Shenandoah Valley, because I'm sure the birders know where a lot of these locations are. And that's where citizen science is really important because, we're limited with staff and time and resources. So yeah, those citizen scientists out there are incredibly important.
So we're at 8:30 and you've answered, kindly answered about 20 questions.
Uh,
We still have about 20 more that people have
uh,
asked,
yeah,
but I'm going to wrap it up at maybe just a couple more, if that's okay.
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, however many
Okay.
you want to do.
Okay. What do you do or tell airports and planes to avoid airstrikes with the Eagles?
Yeah, what they're working with now with the military is trying to nail down certain times and highlight on maps because the modeling's still going on. The project's not complete yet. But I think that's what they're looking at doing, to be able to highlight these areas, particularly for military aircraft, because they do low level flights, to inform them at what times a year, what areas on the landscape where, there's a greater probability of strike. Most of the management to date has been looking at and assessing what nests are high risk. So when these nestlings fledge, they stay very close to the nest, for a few weeks, and then they start making these pioneering flights out where they keep going a little further, and that's where they become a strike risk. And unfortunately, they like to loaf on airstrips, sit on airstrips, that sort of thing. And this telemetry data will help highlight what nests are of higher strike risk. And you can't just simply say, well, you're going to manage or eliminate all nests within a half mile of an airport. it all depends on the configuration of where the nest is, where the runway is, and where the water is. So if there's a runway between the nest and its foraging area, obviously that's a problem. Um, if it's a nest away from a runway and near the water where there's not much air traffic, that nest may not be a problem. Those are just some hypotheticals I'm mentioning, but
Mhm.
that's some of the scenarios that they're going to look at and go through.
These two questions sort of go together. What laws or acts were passed that assisted with the resurgence of the eagles? And now that they are delisted, what protections do they currently have, including their habitat? For example, is there any protection for the trees where they have their eyries?
Yeah. So probably the biggest federal law, was the Endangered Species Act, and eagles were highly regulated. When I started in the department 21 years ago, it was much more restrictive in terms of, logging operations, land development near eagle nests. So that had a big impact. It was delisted. The other act that came before the Endangered Species Act, that protected eagles, not so much habitat, but the eagle itself, was the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, and that said you couldn't kill eagles, destroy their nests, collect their eggs, that sort of thing. After the eagle was delisted from the Federal Endangered Species Act, there were some measures put in, some additional measures in the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act that somewhat protects habitat. So if a land developer wants to put a development in near an eagle nest, there are federal guidelines, and we have some state guidelines as well, that have a starting point to talk about management around a given nest, and how close you can develop to the nest. And we apply those. When I say we, it's usually the feds that make the final call, although we actually go out on the ground and do the ground truthing of it, because it is a federal call. But we usually look at what's occurring on the landscape. So if an eagle puts a nest up in someone's backyard, obviously there's not going to be really any restrictions other than don't cut the tree down. If it's in pristine habitat where there's never been any human encroachment, that's where there may be more stringent guidance recommended by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's done on a case-by-case basis. That's contingent on the landscape, how habituated the birds are to disturbance, and those sorts of things. So I think did I cover everything for that one?
You did.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time for the presentation,
Yeah.
and for answering so many questions. I'm sorry to everybody who we didn't get to questions. I apologize for that. But Jeff, again, we want to be mindful of your time.
Yeah.
For anyone who wants to access the presentation, the recording will be placed on the Friends of Dyke Marsh website, and look for it in a couple days, not immediately, but it will be there soon.
Okay, cool.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jeff. That was a fantastic presentation.
Yeah.
And we really applaud all the good work that you're doing and that your department's doing.
Yeah.
And just keep letting us know what we should be doing. Okay, because we want to protect and restore habitat, and maybe we have a lot of more eagles than we used to, but I'm not sure we could ever have too many. So
okay.
So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Yep.
And we'll see you at our May meeting. Thank you, Deborah.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Good night.
Night.